One question. That is all it took. Not a loud question. Not an aggressive question. Not the kind of question that announces itself as an attack and that gives the person being attacked the specific warning that allows them to assemble the defenses before the attack arrives. A quiet question. Delivered in the specific and slightly elevated tone that Joy Behar used when she had thought about something and had arrived at a conclusion about the something and was now presenting the conclusion in the form of a question as a courtesy to the person the conclusion was about, giving them the opportunity to respond to the conclusion before the conclusion became simply the thing that had been said about them on live television in front of a studio audience and millions of people watching at home. One quiet question with a conclusion inside it. And Dolly Parton heard it and the studio went quiet in the specific and slightly breathless way that studios go quiet when something has happened that the studio was not expecting, and Dolly Parton said the thing she said in the voice she used for everything, which was the warm and clear and completely unhurried voice of someone who had nothing to protect and nothing to hide and who was therefore never in a hurry to say anything because the thing she was going to say was simply true and true. Things do not require hurrying, and the panel went silent and the audience stood up. Not because she had shouted. Not because she had delivered the devastating comeback that the dramatic version of this story would have scripted. But because what she said was exactly right in the specific and complete way that the exactly right thing said at the exactly right moment is exactly right, and the exactly right thing said at the exactly right moment always produces the silence first and then whatever comes after the silence, and on this morning what came after the silence was the studio audience standing up and Joy Behar having nothing left to say. Joy Behar had been at the table for 30 years. This is not a small thing and it is not a thing that should be said without the full weight of what 30 years at that table actually means, which is 30 years of saying the things that were uncomfortable and the things that were unpopular and the things that the other people in the room were thinking, but that required someone specific with a specific kind of courage and a specific kind of comfort with the consequences of saying uncomfortable things to actually say. She had that courage and she had that comfort and she had developed them through the specific and accumulating experience of 30 years of saying the uncomfortable thing and surviving the consequences and discovering through the surviving that the consequences were survivable and that the thing worth saying was always worth the surviving, that the discomfort of saying it was always less than the dishonesty of not saying it. She was not a villain. This is important. The stories that cast her as the villain are always missing something that is essential to understanding what actually happened in the rooms where the memorable things happened, which is that the questions she asked were almost always genuine questions, that the conclusions she drew were almost always honest conclusions, that the discomfort she produced in the people she produced it in was almost always the discomfort of honest engagement rather than the discomfort of cruelty, which are two completely different varieties of discomfort and which require completely different responses from the person experiencing them. She had looked at Dolly Parton and she had thought about what she was looking at and she had arrived at a genuine question about what she was looking at, a question that had to do with the specific and very constructed quality of the image and what the image was doing and whether the image was the same as the person or whether the person was underneath the image and what the relationship between the image and the person actually was. This was not a trivial question. It was the kind of question that serious people asked about public figures who had built public images of the completeness and the specific character that Dolly Parton had built, and it was the kind of question that deserved a serious answer, and Joy Behar was going to ask it because she was someone who asked the questions that deserved to be asked regardless of whether the asking of them was comfortable for anyone including herself. She had formed the question and she had placed it in the conversation at the moment the conversation had produced the space for it and she had delivered it in the tone that was her tone, the tone of the conclusion presented as a question, and she had directed it at Dolly Parton who was sitting across from her in sequins and blonde hair with the warm smile that had been the consistent and visible face of 60 years of public life. Dolly Parton had been receiving questions about her image for 60 years. Not the exact question that Joy Behar had just asked but the question underneath the question about whether the image was a performance and whether the performance was a concealment and whether the warmth and the accessibility and the specific and very Dolly quality of everything about her public presentation was the thing itself or something that had been constructed over the thing, something designed to produce in the people who encountered it the response it reliably produced. Which was the response of warmth and familiarity and the feeling of knowing someone you had never actually met. She had been asked this question in various forms by various people over 60 years, and she had answered it in various ways over those 60 years, and the various ways had evolved and refined themselves through the 60 years of answering until they had arrived at the specific and complete and entirely honest answer that the question deserved, and that she was now going to give to Joy Behar on this morning in this studio, with this specific quality of certainty and warmth and the particular calm of someone who is not defending something but simply saying something, not protecting a position but stating a fact. She listened to Joy's question with the complete and unhurried attention that she brought to everything, the attention that did not show the hearing of the question before the question had finished being asked, that did not produce the visible preparation of the response before the asking was complete, that honored the full length of the question with the full weight of her attention and then produced the response in the space that the question's completion made available. She did not rush. There was no urgency in her. The urgency that a person feels when they need to defend something was absent because there was nothing to defend, because the question, however pointed, was pointing at something that she was not afraid to let be pointed at, that she was in fact entirely willing to have pointed at, because the pointing at it would produce the opportunity to say the thing that was simply true about it, and the true thing was not something she needed to protect and was not something that the pointing at it could damage. She said she had grown up with nothing. She said it in the way that she said things about her childhood, with the specific and completely genuine quality of someone for whom the facts of the childhood were the facts of the childhood and not the curated version of the childhood that public figures sometimes present, not the strategic deployment of a difficult origin story in the service of a current narrative, but simply the honest accounting of what the childhood had been. 1 room in the mountains of Tennessee. 12 children. Not enough of anything. Not enough food and not enough space and not enough money and not enough of the things that the people who were now examining her image had grown up having enough of, and who therefore had perhaps not fully developed the specific and visceral understanding of what it meant to be invisible in the specific way that poverty makes people invisible, to be in the world without the resources that make people in the world visible to the other people in the world, to be someone who had to find their own way to be seen because the world as organized did not see them automatically or by default. She had looked at the world, she said, and she had understood what the world responded to. She had understood this the way that people who have grown up invisible understand the things that make people visible, with the specific and urgent clarity of someone for whom visibility was not a given but a goal, not the natural state of their existence but the thing they were working toward, not something they could assume but something they had to build. And she had built it. She had looked at what was available to her, which was a voice and a face and a particular quality of presence and a gift for writing songs that came from the actual material of the actual life she had lived, and she had taken all of it and she had made it as visible as she possibly could, had amplified and exaggerated and stylized it into the specific and impossible to overlook form that had been the form of Dolly Parton for 60 years, the form that Joy Behar's question had been asking about. The form that was the sequins and the hair and the specific and very deliberate quality of someone who had decided that if the world was going to see her it was going to see all of her, and that all of her was going to be as completely and as unapologetically itself as she could make it. She said all of this in the warm voice without the edge that the context might have seemed to demand. She said it without defensiveness and without the specific and recognizable quality of a person who is being asked about something they find uncomfortable and who is managing their discomfort through the response rather than addressing the question through the response. She was addressing the question directly and completely and with the full and honest quality of someone for whom the question was interesting rather than threatening, because the question was about something true and the truth of it was the thing she was going to talk about rather than the thing she was going to manage the distance from. She talked about what it meant to come from nothing and to decide to make yourself into something, and what the making involved and what the making required and what it cost and what it gave back and what the relationship between the cost and the return had taught her about the world and about herself and about the specific and deeply personal project of being completely and visibly yourself in a world that does not always make room for the completely visible self, of people who come from where she came from. And then she said the thing. She said it at the end of everything else she had said, not as a replacement for everything else but as the specific and compressed form of it, the 5 or 6 words that contained the whole of what the rest had been working toward, that arrived with the specific quality of the thing that is said when the ground has been sufficiently prepared for it to land at its full weight rather than to need to carry the full weight of the explanation that gives it the weight. She said she knew there were people who looked at the image and what they saw was a joke. She said she had known this for a long time. She said she had thought about it for a long time. And then she said she had decided that it did not matter what those people saw when they looked at her, because what she saw when she looked at herself was a woman who had come from nothing and built something from nothing, and who had built it with the specific and unapologetic fullness of herself rather than with a smaller and safer and more conventionally acceptable version of herself. She said that the building of it was the point. That the fullness of it was the point. That the being unable to overlook it was the point. That the people who looked at it and saw the joke were looking at the thing that had been built specifically to be seen by the people who would have preferred not to see her, that the exaggeration was the answer to the invisibility, that the sequins were the response to the one-room cabin, that the whole of the image was simply her, all of her, turned up as loud as it would go because the world had required her to turn it up that loud before it would hear her, and that she did not apologize for the loudness and was not going to apologize for the loudness, and found, actually, when she considered it, that the only possible response to the suggestion that the loudness was something to apologize for was to be exactly as loud as she had always been, and probably a little louder. Joy Behar was quiet. The quiet on Joy Behar's face in the seconds after Dolly finished was the quiet of someone who had asked a real question and received an answer that was more complete and more honest and more interesting and more true than the question had been prepared for. Who was in the genuine and slightly humbling position of having underestimated the person they were talking to in the specific way that it is possible to underestimate someone whose surface is so warm and so accessible that the depth underneath the surface is not immediately apparent to someone approaching from the outside with the assumption that the warmth is the whole of it. She had underestimated Dolly Parton. The answer was making the underestimation visible in the way that things are made visible when they are simply and completely true. And Joy Behar was honest enough to be visibly affected by the visibility rather than to perform the impression that she had not been affected. She was quiet. The table was quiet. The room was quiet with the specific quality of the room that has just received something. And then the studio audience stood up. Not because someone told them to. Not because a sign lit up above their heads or a stage manager signaled that the appropriate response to what they had just heard was the standing ovation rather than the seated applause. One person stood. And then another. And then the people around them who had their own version of the same feeling and who could see that the person next to them had stood and who found that the standing was the thing their body also needed to do in response to what they had just witnessed. In response to being in the presence of something that was true and complete and said without decoration in a room where things were usually said with considerable decoration and where the decoration usually substituted for the truth rather than expressing it. They stood because Dolly Parton had said something that was exactly what the moment required and not one thing more, that had the specific and rare quality of the thing said in the right words at the right moment by the right person. And that quality was the quality that standing up is the body's honest response to when the body is in the room where it is happening and when the body recognizes it before the mind has fully processed what the body is recognizing. Dolly Parton sat in the chair with the same smile she had brought into the room. The smile that Joy Behar's question had been asking about. The smile that was the specific and visible form of the image that had been constructed over 60 years from the raw material of a one-room cabin and 12 children and not enough of anything. The smile that was not a performance of warmth but warmth itself, that was not a mask over the person but the person herself, that was the thing and not the representation of the thing, that had been questioned and had answered the questioning by being exactly and completely what it had always been and what it was always going to be regardless of whether anyone questioned it, because it was the thing itself and the thing itself does not change because it has been questioned. It was still there. It was going to be there tomorrow and the day after that and through however many more years remained of the 60 years of public life that had produced it, unchanged and undiminished and exactly as it had always been, which was exactly Dolly Parton turned up as loud as she needed to be heard and not 1 decibel less. Joy Behar found something to say eventually. She always found something to say eventually. 30 years had given her the specific and durable ability to find the thing to say even after the moments that took the thing away briefly, even after the moments when she had been genuinely and completely and honestly affected by something and when the being affected had temporarily emptied the space where the thing to say usually lived. She said something that acknowledged what had just been said in the acknowledgement form rather than the agreement form, in the way that someone acknowledges something when they are not sure they agree with it but they are sure they are not going to argue with it, when the thing that has been said has landed with enough completeness that the arguing with it would require more of them than the moment made available. She said it and then she moved the conversation forward in the way that conversations on that show always moved forward, which was to the next thing, the next topic, the next segment, the forward motion of the program that did not stop even when the program had produced something that everyone in the room needed a moment to absorb. The morning ended the way mornings on that show always ended. The goodbye and the thank you and the announcement of what was coming next. But the room it ended in was not the same room it had started in. Something had happened in the room that made it different from the room it would have been if the morning had been the morning it was planned to be, if the interview had been the interview that everyone had arrived expecting it to be, if Joy Behar's question had produced the managed response that managed responses produce, and that the program and the audience and everyone watching at home had learned to expect from the well-prepared celebrity in the comfortable chair with the good lighting and the practiced smile. The managed response had not been the response. The real thing had been the response. And the real thing had made the room different in the specific and invisible and entirely permanent way that the real thing always makes rooms different when it happens in them. In the way that cannot be undone by the goodbye and the thank you and the announcement of what is coming next, because the thing happened and the thing that happens does not happen, and the room that the happening happened in is the room that the happening happened in for as long as the room exists and the people who were in it carry it. Dolly Parton left the studio. She left with the same quality she had arrived with, which was the quality of someone who had nothing to protect and who had therefore lost nothing, who had come with the full and honest version of herself and had given the full and honest version of herself to the morning, and who was therefore leaving with exactly what she had arrived with, which was the full and honest version of herself, unchanged and undiminished and exactly as it had always been, which was the specific and complete and absolutely characteristic form of Dolly Parton, turned up as loud as the world had required her to turn it up to be seen, and not 1 decibel less. The sequins caught the light as she walked out. They always caught the light. That was the point.